There are winters that arrive like weather, and there are winters that arrive like judgment. The kind that does not announce itself with a gradual cooling, with the slow retreat of leaves, with the reasonable shortening of days that allows the body to prepare, to layer, to quietly negotiate with the coming cold. This was not that kind of winter. This was the other kind. The kind that descends in a single night with the finality of a verdict, dropping temperatures by 30 degrees in the span of hours, turning mud to iron, turning rivers to stone, turning the ground itself into something that no longer yields to the shovel or the boot or the will of the man pressing against it. The kind of winter that the people who have always lived inside it carry in their bones as both memory and warning. The kind that visitors learn about. Only a fetorite has already claimed something from them. A finger, a foot, a unit, an army. In the autumn of 1941, nearly 3 million German soldiers stood at the edge of this reckoning and did not yet understand what they were standing at the edge of. They had come so far, farther perhaps than any army in history had moved so quickly through such vast distances against such substantial opposition. They had crossed rivers that were supposed to be natural barriers. They had encircled armies that were supposed to be too large to encircle. They had advanced through landscapes that stretched the imagination, flat, open, endless in a way that European eyes were not prepared for, a horizontal infinity that made the maps feel abstract, almost theoretical, as if the land itself refused to be reduced to lines and symbols on paper. They had done all of this in 4 months. 4 months of movement, of breakthrough, of encirclement, and capture of momentum, so sustained and so overwhelming that the men who carried it began, perhaps, to believe that momentum was a permanent condition rather than a temporary state. They were about to learn otherwise. The winter of 1941 on the Eastern Front is remembered now as the moment that turning became imaginable. But that framing, useful as it is for historians and strategists, does something subtle and damaging to the reality of what it was. It transforms a human catastrophe into a narrative hinge. It makes it about outcomes rather than experience. It asks us to understand 100,000 cases of frostbite, tens of thousands of deaths from exposure, the slow mechanical failure of an entire military machine, as the precondition for something that came later rather than as the event itself, complete and terrible in its own right. Tonight we return to that cold, not to the campaign as arrow on a map, not to the operational history of Army Group Center's advance and retreat, though those things are here, embedded in the story, because they cannot be separated from it, but to the cold itself, to what it did, specifically and without metaphor, to the men and machines and plans that met it, to the arithmetic of degrees and calories and kilometers and days that the German army had not calculated correctly, and that the winter calculated for them, precisely, relentlessly, without error. If these long, unhurried journeys into the forgotten weight of history help you slow down, step away from the noise of the day, or find somewhere quiet to rest your thoughts, then stay. And if you find yourself returning here, to this space, to this kind of storytelling, consider subscribing. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting content. You're helping keep this calm, immersive kind of storytelling alive. Settle in. This is the story of the German nightmare at the Eastern Front in the winter of 1941. June 22nd, 1941. The border between German-occupied Poland and Soviet-controlled territory. 4:15 in the morning. The sky still held the last grey hour before dawn, that ambiguous threshold where night has withdrawn, but daylight has not yet committed itself, and in that suspended darkness 3 million men began to move east. Operation Barbarossa was, by any measure that military history uses to mark ambition, the largest military operation ever launched. 153 divisions, 3 army groups stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, a front that measured nearly 2,000 kilometers from end to end, and that would expand as the armies pushed deeper into Soviet territory, as the wedge broadened with every kilometer of advance, adding width as fast as it added department. 3,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft fleet, 600,000 motor vehicles, 700,000 horses, the horse, not the tank, remaining the primary means of moving supplies in an army that had conquered Western Europe and was now attempting to conquer the largest country on earth. The plan, in its broad architecture, was simple in the way that plans for catastrophe of Eton appear simple. Before the catastrophe, the Soviet Union was to be defeated in a single campaign lasting 8 to 10 weeks. The bulk of the Red Army's operational strength was to be encircled and destroyed west of the Dnieper and Dwina rivers, before the Soviets could pull their forces back into the interior, before they could trade space for time, before the autumn rains and then the winter cold could intervene on their behalf. The economic and administrative heart of the Soviet state, Moscow, Leningrad, the industrial regions of Ukraine, was to be captured or at minimum rendered incapable of sustaining further resistance. And then perhaps by October, perhaps by November at the absolute latest, German forces would consolidate along a line running roughly from Arkhangelsk in the north to Astrakhan in the south, a line that planners called the AA line, a geographic shorthand for the edge of the European Soviet Union, beyond which the remaining Asiatic remnants of Soviet power would, the theory went, be incapable of meaningful action. The plan was not, in its initial execution, a failure. This is the part of the story that is easy to forget when one knows how it ends. Operation Barbarossa was, in the summer and early autumn of 1941, a sequence of stunning German victories, each one larger and more complete than the last. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad, reaching the outskirts of the city by September. Army Group South swept through Ukraine, the encirclement at Kiev in September, producing the capture of more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers, the single largest encirclement in the history of warfare. Army Group Center, the largest and most powerful of the three, drove east along the old invasion corridor, the historic road to Moscow, advancing through Minsk, through Smolensk, through the successive defensive lines the Soviet command frantically attempted to erect in its path. The encirclements were staggering. Minsk, at the end of June, over 300,000 prisoners. Smolensk in August, 300,000 more. The Soviet Union, in the course of those summer months, lost armies that would have constituted the entire armed forces of most European nations. Lost them not in battles of sustained attrition, but in the sudden closing of armoured pincers, in the collapse of defensive fronts, in the catastrophic coordination failures of a military system that had been decapitated by Stalin's purges of its officer corps, and had not yet rebuilt the institutional knowledge and confident professional judgment that those purges had destroyed. And yet the Red Army did not stop. This is the other part of the story, the part that the early victories tend to obscure, the part that began to accumulate significance through the summer, like water rising behind a dam. The Red Army took catastrophic losses and continued to exist. It was encircled and destroyed in formation after formation, and yet new formations appeared behind the destroyed ones. It fell back, and fell back again, and kept falling back, but never dissolved, never ceased to be an army in any meaningful sense, never presented the German High Command with the decisive moment they had anticipated. The moment when Soviet resistance would simply cease to be organized, when the remaining forces would disintegrate into a rabble incapable of coherent opposition. That moment never came. The Germans noticed. They began to talk about it in their diary entries, and their letters home, and their operational reports with an unease that is, reading those documents now, unmistakable. The number of prisoners taken in each encirclement was enormous, and yet when the next German advance began, there were Soviet forces to oppose it. The divisions listed in Soviet order of battle assessments were destroyed, and new ones appeared with new designations. The Soviet industrial capacity to replace lost equipment was underestimated, consistently and persistently, because German military intelligence had no reliable way to assess what was being produced in the Ural Mountains and in Siberia, in the factories that had been relocated east beyond the reach of German bombers, and were now in conditions of extraordinary hardship, producing tanks and artillery and aircraft in numbers that would only become fully apparent later. But in the late summer and early autumn of 1941, these were accumulating concerns rather than operational crises. The momentum was still there, the advances were still being made, and, in September, as the scale of the Kiev encirclement became clear, as the prisoner counts reached numbers that seemed almost impossible, the German High Command made the decision that would define everything that came after. They turned the main thrust of Army Group Center back toward Moscow. They called it Operation Typhoon. They believed, with the conviction of men who have won too much too quickly, that Moscow was the decisive objective, that its capture would end the war, that the 8 to 10 weeks remaining in the usable campaigning season were sufficient. They were not sufficient. The mathematics had already shifted in ways the planners had not yet processed. October 2nd, 1941, the forests west of Moscow. Early morning, temperature at dawn -4 degrees Celsius. Ground still firm enough for movement, the trees still holding the last of their autumn colour, amber and rust, and the pale gold that precedes dissolution. 150 kilometers from Moscow, give or take, depending on which road you chose and what condition that road was in by the time you reached it, which was already becoming a variable that did not favor optimism. Army Group Center began Operation Typhoon with approximately 1 million men and 1,000 tanks. The initial momentum was violent and promising. The Red Army, caught again in the wrong positions, encircled at Bryansk and Vyazma simultaneously, lost another 600,000 men to German pockets in the first weeks of October. The road to Moscow appeared open. German reconnaissance elements reported that they could see the golden domes of Moscow's churches through their field glasses on clear days. The German propaganda apparatus, anticipating imminent triumph, prepared the announcement. Journalists were gathered near the front to record the entry into the Soviet capital. Then the rain came. It came the way October rain comes in that part of Russia, which is to say, thoroughly, persistently, without apology. The ground, which had been firm enough to support tanks and trucks and the entire mechanical weight of a modern armoured advance, became something different. The word that German soldiers used for it, in their diaries and letters and later memoirs, was Schlamm. Mud. But Schlamm was inadequate for what this was. The soil of that region is a particular kind of clay-heavy earth that does not drain, that does not compact under pressure, but instead absorbs it, that transforms under sustained rainfall from a surface into a medium, something between solid and liquid, something that neither bears weight nor flows away, that simply holds whatever enters it and does not release it. German soldiers wrote about their boots being pulled from their feet by the suction of it. They wrote about horses sinking to their bellies and requiring teams of men to extract. They wrote about tanks which weighed 30 tons and moved on broad steel treads, sinking to their hulls and requiring other tanks to pull them out. And sometimes the other tanks would sink as well. They wrote about roads, the few paved roads that existed, the many that were simply compressed earth, becoming trenches of liquid mud, a metre deep, that swallowed vehicles whole. The Germans called this period the Rasputitsa. The Soviets had a word for it too, the same word which should have been informative. It means approximately the season when roads dissolve. It happens twice a year in that region, once in autumn when the rains come, and the ground freezes from below before it can drain from above. And once in spring, when the accumulated snow melts faster than the earth can absorb it, the Soviets knew about the Rasputitsa. Their logistical planning accommodated it. German planning had noted it, and had expected to be through it by October, past Moscow and into the consolidation phase before the mud arrived. The mud arrived before Moscow did. The advance slowed. In some sectors it stopped entirely for days at a time. Units that had been consuming 30 to 50 kilometers per day in the summer, advances were now measuring progress in kilometers per week. Supply columns that struggled to keep pace with armoured advances in good conditions now faced something categorically different. The problem was not merely that vehicles moved slowly through the mud, but that vehicles stopped moving at all, became obstacles themselves, their cargoes stranded in the middle of roads that were no longer roads, their fuel consumed in futile spinning of wheels, their drivers exhausted by the pure physical labour of trying to keep machines in motion through a medium that resisted every effort. The arithmetic of supply had been marginal before the mud. It became a crisis during it. To understand what the German supply situation actually was in October and November of 1941, it is necessary to understand the structure of the supply system and why that structure had been adequate for the campaign as originally envisioned and catastrophically inadequate for the campaign as it actually developed. German logistics in 1941 operated on the assumption of a fast campaign. Supplies would be pre-positioned in large dumps near the front, consumed rapidly as the advance moved, then replenished by rail as the front moved forward, and railway engineers converted Soviet rail lines, which used a wider gauge than European standard, to German gauge. This system worked. It worked at Minsk. It worked at Smolensk. The conversion teams kept pace. The trains moved forward. The dumps were replenished. But the conversion process took time, and the front was moving faster than the conversion could accommodate. By October, Army Group Centre was operating at the end of a supply line whose railway terminus was hundreds of kilometres behind the front, with the intervening distance covered by trucks on roads that were now impassable. The deficit was not measured in days. It was measured in the daily consumption requirements of a 1,000,000-man army, multiplied by the number of days between what was being delivered and what was being consumed, and that number had been growing since summer. By October it had become a structural feature of the campaign rather than a temporary shortfall. The army was eating the future, consuming reserves that were supposed to sustain the consolidation phase to fund the advance phase, drawing down stockpiles that could not be replenished at the same rate they were being drawn down, existing in a permanent state of material deficit that discipline and momentum and the psychological difficulty of acknowledging the arithmetic kept invisible in the operational reports. Each division required roughly 500 tons of supplies per day to operate at full intensity. Ammunition, food, fuel, replacement parts, medical supplies. Army Group Centre had, at various points during typhoon, between 50 and 150 tons per division per day reaching the front. The deficit between what was needed and what arrived did not vanish. It accumulated. It became a weight carried forward with every kilometre of advance, invisible in the daily operational reports that focused on distance gained, and prisoners taken, visible only in the slow degradation of fighting strength. The depletion of ammunition reserves, the increasing percentage of vehicles out of action for lack of spare parts, the growing lists of men reported sick or unfit. The cold had not arrived yet. Not the real cold, not the killing cold. It was coming. November 1st, 1941. The Moscow highway 60 kilometers west of the capital. A German signals corporal named Werner Adamczyk, 23 years old, from a small town in Silesia, crouching beside his motorcycle in the pre-dawn dark, trying to start an engine that had run perfectly well the previous evening and that now refused to respond to anything he did. The oil in the crankcase had thickened overnight to something approaching the consistency of butter. The grease in the wheel bearings had hardened into an adhesive that resisted the wheels turning. The rubber of the tires had stiffened in the cold. The rubber of his gloves had stiffened in the cold. His fingers were already numb through the gloves, already at that threshold of cold where the hands know they are being damaged and send the signal upward. But the signal arrives distant and unclear, more information than sensation. He would write about this morning later in a memoir published decades after the war. And what he would write was not about the operational implications of equipment failure in the early winter, but about the specific quality of the cold itself, the way it was different from anything he had experienced, the way it was not a sensation but an absence, the way it removed things, warmth, flexibility, motivation, the future, with a thoroughness that felt deliberate. The temperature on the morning of November 1st was minus 15 degrees Celsius. In 3 weeks, it would be minus 30. In 6 weeks, in the deepest part of the winter, it would reach minus 42 degrees in some sectors, a temperature at which the distinction between air and weapon becomes academic, at which the cold itself performs the work of killing without requiring any assistance. The German army was not equipped for this. The statement is so basic, so thoroughly documented, so frequently repeated in histories of the Eastern Front, that it risks losing its specific gravity, becoming a historical shorthand rather than a concrete reality. So it is worth dwelling on exactly what it meant, in material terms, for the men and machines that had arrived at the edge of winter, without preparation for winter. The standard German Army winter issue in 1941 was the same winter uniform worn on the Western Front, and in North Africa, a greatcoat, standard issue boots, gloves that were adequate for European winters. The greatcoat was wool, which has genuine insulating properties, but wool has limits, and those limits fall well short of minus 30 degrees. At minus 30, a wool greatcoat is a garment that preserves the form of a coat without performing the function of one. German soldiers in November and December of 1941 were wearing every item of clothing they possessed, in layers, sometimes including civilian clothing taken from Soviet villages, sometimes including women's clothing, sometimes including items stripped from Soviet prisoners or Soviet dead. Not from cruelty, but from the simple thermodynamic reality that the items they had been issued were insufficient and the items available were what was available. The boots were the particular catastrophe. Standard German army boots in 1941 were leather, designed for movement and durability, not for insulation against temperatures that the designers had not anticipated needing to insulate against. At minus 20, leather boots conduct cold rather than resist it. They become conduits, drawing heat from the feet and transmitting the temperature of the ground through the sole and into the skin with a thoroughness that no amount of additional socks can fully counteract. The Soviet solution, developed over generations of winters that annually produced temperatures of this magnitude, was the Valenki, a boot made of compressed wool felt, thick and shapeless and deeply unglamorous, without a recognizable sole, looking to a European eye like a boot designed by someone who had only heard boots described rather than seen one. The Valenki worked. It worked at minus 40. It worked because felt is a poor conductor of cold, because its structure creates insulating air pockets, because it was made for this specific purpose by people who understood what this specific purpose required. German soldiers who captured Valenki wore them. German soldiers who did not have them developed frostbite. The frostbite statistics from the German Eastern Front in the winter of 1941 are taken as numbers alone difficult to process as human reality. Over 100,000 cases of frostbite requiring medical treatment in the period from November 1941 through January 1942. with a significant proportion of those cases resulting in amputation. The mathematics of it: a division equivalent of soldiers rendered permanently or temporarily combat ineffective, not by Soviet bullets, but by the temperature of the air around them. More men were evacuated from the front with frostbite than with wounds from enemy action during certain weeks of December. The medical system, designed for the wounds of a short campaign, was not equipped for the volume or the nature of cold weather casualties. Field hospitals filled with men whose fingers and toes had died and whose bodies were in the process of recognizing that death and responding to it with inflammation and gangrene. Surgeons who had trained for abdominal wounds and penetrating trauma were performing amputations at every level of every extremity, working through the night by inadequate light in buildings that could not be heated sufficiently, their own fingers cold, their instruments cold, their patients cold. The machines failed in parallel with the men. An internal combustion engine, at its core, is a heat engine. It generates power through the controlled combustion of fuel, and the system that delivers that fuel, that lubricates its moving parts. That allows those parts to move with the precision required for combustion to occur, depends on maintaining its components within temperature ranges that permit normal mechanical function. Below those ranges, which in 1941 German engines were not designed to extend, everything that is liquid becomes problematic. Engine oil, at -25, thickens from a lubricant to a semi-solid that destroys bearings rather than protecting them. Hydraulic fluid and gun-traversing mechanisms freezes and locks turrets into fixed forward positions. Cooling water, inadequately antifreezed, because antifreeze had not been supplied in quantities sufficient for Russian conditions, freezes and expands and cracks engine blocks. The overnight death of an engine that has no physical wound, that simply encountered temperatures for which it was not prepared and responded by destroying itself from within. The numbers accumulated with the relentlessness of a mathematical proof. In October and November of 1941, German vehicle availability across Army Group Center dropped from roughly 70% operational to 30% and continued falling. Tank strength in many divisions reached 30% of authorized establishment. Not because Soviet action had destroyed tanks, though Soviet action had destroyed many tanks, but because tanks whose tracks cracked in the cold, whose engines could not be started in the morning, whose gun mechanisms were frozen in position, were as absent from the battle as tanks that had been hit by Soviet anti-tank fire. The ghost army of broken equipment grew through November and December, a vast inventory of machines that occupied space, required guards, required recovery teams, required spare parts that were not coming, and contributed nothing to the mission. The Luftwaffe faced the same crisis in the air. Aircraft engines require warm oil for starting, require de-icing equipment for operations, require ground crews who can work efficiently, require maintenance schedules that become impossible when a wrench dropped on the ground takes a minute to retrieve, because a man's hands no longer respond quickly to simple commands. German aircraft availability fell through the winter months, as the cold applied to aircraft the same arithmetic it applied to every other machine. Patient, precise, without exception, working through the night, while the mechanics tried to sleep, and still the advance continued. This is perhaps the most remarkable and, in retrospect, the most terrible fact about November and December of 1941, that the German army, in this condition, with this degree of material and human attrition, continued to push toward Moscow. The operation continued not, because the High Command was unaware of the conditions. The situation reports made the conditions clear enough, even filtered through the reluctance of commanders to report problems that might reflect on their own command capability, but because stopping was, in the operational psychology of that moment, unthinkable. Stopping meant admitting that the timetable had failed. Stopping meant wintering in positions that offered no natural defensive advantages, in the open fields and thin forests west of Moscow, without the shelter that cities and established defensive lines would provide. Stopping meant giving the Red Army, which had been absorbing punishment for 5 months without dissolving, time to reconstitute, to resupply, to bring forward the Siberian divisions that German intelligence suspected were being transferred from the Soviet Far East. Stopping meant acknowledging a set of facts that the psychological architecture of the campaign, its entire structure of expectation and momentum and institutional commitment to the original plan, had not equipped the decision-makers to acknowledge. So they went forward. November 15th, 1941. The ground had frozen hard again, a feat of the Rasputitsa. This was, in a specific and limited operational sense, good news. Frozen ground bears weight. Tanks that had been mired in mud could move. Roads that had been trenches of liquid clay were now firm enough for wheeled vehicles. The supply situation briefly improved as the frozen surface allowed truck convoys to move at something approaching normal speed. The advance resumed with an energy that had a slightly desperate quality to it, the energy of men who had been waiting in the mud and the cold, and who understood, without perhaps articulating it clearly, that the window for movement was finite, that behind the current cold was a deeper cold that would close all remaining options. The final push toward Moscow, which began on November 15th, and would continue into early December, is one of the most studied operations of the Second World War, analysed from every angle, reconstructed from German and Soviet archival sources, memorialised by the men who survived it, and by the historians who have tried to understand why men in that condition continued to advance. It is worth understanding what the men doing the advancing were actually experiencing, as opposed to what the operational maps show. Take a single regiment, say a regiment of the 258th Infantry Division, which fought in the Army Group Centre advance, and whose regimental records survive in reasonable completeness. In June 1941, the regiment crossed the Soviet border with roughly 3,000 men, at authorized strength, well equipped, fed, rested a feat of the month since the Western campaign, carrying the psychological momentum of an army that had not yet lost a major engagement. By November 15th, the regiment had approximately 1,200 men capable of offensive action. Not 1,200 because of casualties alone, though casualties had been severe, but 1,200 because of the combined arithmetic of killed, wounded, sick, frostbitten, evacuated for equipment-related injuries, missing, and the category that military records sometimes describe as exhaustion cases, and that the men themselves would have described in simpler terms. The regiment had 40% of its authorized strength. Its weapons were functional at roughly the same ratio. Its ammunition reserves were below the minimum threshold for sustained offensive operations. Its winter clothing issue remained incomplete. Its horses, which moved the artillery and the supply wagons, were dying at a rate that could not be replaced. Horses that had been fed inadequately since August, horses that had been worked continuously through the summer and autumn advances, horses whose feed requirements the supply system had consistently underfulfilled, and who had progressively lost the body condition that is the biological reserve against catastrophic cold. When temperatures reached -25, horses without adequate body fat died. They died in their thousands across the German front, and each dead horse was a portion of the supply and artillery capability of the formation they served, lost permanently. The regiment advanced anyway. The Soviets defending Moscow were, by November, a different force than the Soviets who had faced the initial Barbarossa assault. This requires emphasis because the narrative of the winter counteroffensive, with its drama and its significance, can obscure how dramatic the Soviet reconstitution actually was. The Red Army that had been encircled at Kiev and Vyazma and Bryansk, that had lost over 4 million men killed and captured in the first 5 months of the war, had been replaced, not by the same men, those men were dead or imprisoned, but by new formations built from reserve divisions, from militia units, from the rapid training of conscripts, from the transfer of Siberian divisions whose soldiers were equipped for winter warfare, whose bodies had adapted to cold over generations, whose equipment had been designed and maintained for temperatures that had not yet occurred in the European theatre, but that were entirely familiar to men from Novosibirsk and Krasnoyarsk and Vladivostok. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the defense of Moscow, was building these forces with the specific intention of not merely holding, but counter-attacking. He understood, because he was a commander of extraordinary talent who understood his enemy's situation with clarity, that the German army advancing toward Moscow in November was not the German army that had launched Barbarossa in June. It was a depleted, cold, undersupplied force advancing on momentum, and will and the institutional inability to stop, and that it was doing so without the reserves that would be required to sustain that advance or to defend against a counterattack. He was accumulating those reserves. He was waiting for the cold to do its work a little longer. He was waiting for the Germans to arrive at the point where arrival itself was the defeat. December 1st, 1941. A reconnaissance element of the 258th Infantry Division reached the village of Khimki, on the outskirts of Moscow, close enough to see the spires of the city through binoculars, close enough that some accounts disputed, but repeated, have men claiming to have seen the reflection of light from the Moscow River. If this moment happened as described, it was the closest German forces ever came to Moscow, the geographic apex of a 5-month advance that had covered nearly 1,000 kilometers through the most formidable combination of resistance and terrain and weather that any European army had encountered in the modern era. Whether the reconnaissance element saw the spires or not, the operational reality on December 1st was this: Army Group Center was done. Not because Soviet resistance had become suddenly and dramatically stronger, though it had stiffened considerably. Not because a decisive battle had been lost, though battles had been lost, but because the arithmetic, patient and precise and utterly indifferent to will and momentum and the psychological architecture of expectation, had reached its conclusion. The army had nothing effete to advance with. It was at the end of a supply line that could not sustain it. Its men were at the edge of what human physiology, even subjected to military discipline, and the powerful psychological coercion of the German army's culture and command structure, could endure. Its machines were failing at a rate that no replacement system could match. Its horses were dying. Its officers were writing in their diaries, in language that was careful and measured, but whose meaning was unmistakable, that the army they commanded no longer existed as a functional offensive instrument. The temperature on December 1st was minus 38 degrees Celsius in some sectors. Men Leafeat, lying wounded in the open, died within minutes. The engines of vehicles Leafeat, overnight without heating, could not be started in the morning, regardless of what was done to them. Sentries on 2-hour rotations were developing frostbite within their rotation periods. The army that had advanced 1,000 kilometers was standing still, and standing still in that cold was itself a form of consumption, the cold extracted from every stationary man and every stationary machine, the same arithmetic it extracted from moving ones, with the difference that standing still offered no possibility of reaching a warmer position, no possibility of arrival, only the bare transaction of cold against life, conducted at minus 38, with compound interest. Then the Soviets attacked. December 5th, 1941. The attack that Zhukov had been preparing since October, the attack that German intelligence had assessed as unlikely because German intelligence did not believe the Soviets had the reserves, the men, the will, or the organizational capacity to conduct major offensive operations ahead of the losses of the summer, began at 3 in the morning along a front of approximately 900 kilometers. 58 divisions, 17 tank brigades, 14 cavalry divisions. The Soviets attacked at night, in temperatures that were as lethal to them as to the Germans, but that their equipment was designed for, and their clothing prepared for, attacking precisely the points where the German line was thinnest, where divisions had been stretched to cover frontages that were too wide for their actual strength, where the 30 or 40 or 50% of authorized men still present and capable of combat was spread across positions designed for full-strength units. The German line did not break catastrophically. It would be inaccurate to describe what happened in December as a rout, as a collapse, as the simple destruction of an army in the field. What happened was more complex and in some ways more terrible than a rout, because a rout at least has clarity. What happened was a slow, grinding, contested retreat by an army that had almost nothing feet with which to fight, and that yet fought, that gave up ground by meters rather than kilometers in most sectors. That inflicted substantial casualties on the attacking Soviets, even as it fell back. That maintained a recognizable military coherence, even as the cold and the pressure and the supply situation stripped it of everything that military coherence is supposed to be built on. The retreat was not planned. It could not be planned because Hitler, when the requests for permission to withdraw to more defensible positions began arriving at the High Command in the first week of December, refused them. His refusal was total, and it was immediate, and it was in the circumstances of December 1941, almost entirely divorced from the operational realities his commanders were reporting. He had seen, or believed he had seen, what happened when armies retreated. The retreat became a rout, the rout became a dissolution, the dissolution became the end. Napoleon's army had retreated from Moscow along these same roads, or roads near them, and had dissolved in exactly this cold, and Hitler, whatever his other qualities as a strategic mind, had absorbed that lesson in a form that prevented him from distinguishing between a tactical withdrawal to a defensible line and the catastrophe he feared. He ordered the army to stand. He reinforced the order with threats, and then with replacements, subordinate commanders who would carry out the order where their predecessors had questioned it. He created, in the language of this moment that would echo through every subsequent winter on the Eastern Front, the concept of a Festung, a fortress position, a fixed point that would not retreat regardless of what happened on its flanks, that would hold by will what it could not hold by physical capacity. Some of the fortress positions held, some did not. The operational map of December 1941 and January 1942, when laid against the map of the German advance through November, shows a German line that has folded back from its eastern extremity like a page turning in the wind, not dissolving, but contracting, losing the shape of an offensive advance, and assuming the irregular, bulging, gap-filled shape of a defensive line that is being maintained by men who are doing so through the pure expenditure of the last of their human and material reserves. The cold was the common denominator of everything, not the only factor, not even the most important factor in a purely military analysis that weights forces. And equipment and command decisions, and Soviet operational art, and German command dysfunction in appropriate proportions. But the element that touches everything else, that amplifies every other inadequacy, that converts marginal weaknesses into structural failures, that transforms problems that might have been managed in temperate weather into disasters that could not be managed at -30. Consider the problem of maintaining firing weapons. A rifle at -38 degrees Celsius is not a rifle in the functional sense. The bolt mechanism, which must move with precision across very small tolerances to feed, fire, and extract cartridges, requires lubrication that behaves normally across the temperature range for which it was designed. Standard German weapons oil congealed at -25. Below that temperature, a rifle that functioned perfectly the previous evening might, in the morning, have a bolt that could not be moved by hand strength alone. German soldiers learned to carry their weapons inside their clothing when sleeping, to transfer body heat to the metal, to use whatever substitute lubricants they could find. Thin oils, animal fat, sometimes nothing, running the mechanism dry and accepting the increased wear as the price of having a functional weapon. Soviet weapons, specifically the Mosin Nagant rifle and the PP Sher 41 submachine gun, had been manufactured with Russian winters as a design parameter. Their tolerances were wider, their mechanisms simpler, their lubricant requirements less demanding. The PP She 41 specifically would fire reliably in conditions that made German weapons uncertain, and German soldiers, throughout the winter, when they could, traded their own weapons for captured Soviet ones. Consider the problem of communication. Radio equipment in 1941 used vacuum tubes and batteries. Vacuum tubes function across a wide temperature range, but are fragile and require warm-up time. Batteries, at -30, lose approximately 60 to 70% of their capacity. A battery that would power a radio for 4 hours at room temperature would power it for 70 minutes at -30. Field telephone wire, laid across frozen ground and frozen in place, could not be recovered without breaking, required constant maintenance against the vehicles and feet and horse hooves that crossed it, required operators whose hands were cold enough to make fine motor tasks like connecting terminals a project requiring multiple attempts. Communications across the front in December were intermittent, delayed, sometimes absent. Commanders who needed to know the situation on their flanks could not always know it. The fog of war in December 1941 was literal as well as metaphorical. Fog was frequent, reducing visibility to meters, adding to the isolation of units that were already isolated by cold, and terrain and the failure of their communications equipment. Consider the problem of feeding men. The German army's field kitchen, the Gulaschkanone, literally goulash cannon, the horse-drawn mobile cooker that was the center of German field mess operations, required time to heat food, and required, specifically, that the food being heated was not frozen solid when it arrived. By December 1941, bread rations were being delivered frozen, loaves that had to be cut with a saw, and that took hours of proximity to body heat before they could be eaten. That was still partially frozen in the center when patients gave out and men ate them anyway. Canned goods froze and expanded, sometimes rupturing the cans. Hot food could be prepared at field kitchens, but by the time it was distributed to forward positions, it had cooled to a temperature that was not dangerous, but was not the sustaining warmth that men in those conditions needed. Soldiers described eating frozen food as a particular kind of cold, an interior cold, the cold of introducing something that had been at -30 into a body trying to maintain 37 degrees Celsius. The body responding with an involuntary shudder, a thief eat from the core warmth that was already being consumed faster than it was being replaced. The caloric deficit was severe and structural. Men in extreme cold require between 4,000 and 5,000 calories per day simply to maintain body temperature and basic function, before any physical exertion, before the additional caloric cost of moving through snow, carrying equipment, standing in fixed positions, while the cold works on the extremities. German field rations provided approximately 3,000 calories per day under normal supply conditions, and supply conditions in December 1941 were not normal. The deficit between caloric need and caloric supply ran between 1,000 and 2,000 calories per day, and the human body responds to that deficit the way any deficit system responds, by drawing down reserves. In men who had been in continuous combat operations since June, who had moved hundreds of kilometers on foot, who had not had adequate rest since the summer, whose body fat reserves were already substantially depleted, the reserves available for drawing down were thin. The cold and the hunger were not separate problems. They were the same problem expressed in two different registers, both of them operating on the same finite human resource. It is here that the theme that runs through all of this, the arithmetic, achieves its most direct and most terrible expression. The German army in December 1941 was conducting a calculation it had not chosen to conduct against numbers it had not expected to face, in conditions it had not prepared for. The calculation was simple. What does it cost per day in men and machines and supplies and physical capacity to hold the line that Hitler had ordered held? And what resources remained to meet that cost? The first number was rising as the cold deepened. The second number was falling as the army consumed its reserves. The German response, the defense, the counter-maneuver, the stabilization of a line that was simultaneously being attacked in multiple places by Soviet forces that had found their operational footing in a way they had not possessed in June, represents one of the less celebrated, but arguably most important military achievements of the German army in the entire war. Not celebrated because there is nothing to celebrate, no victory to describe, no climactic moment of resolution. Important because the army that conducted it was, by any reasonable material assessment, already past the point where it should have been capable of coherent military action. The Argev salient. The bulge that formed as German forces held their ground against the Soviet winter offensive in the Arzef-Vyazma area would persist for over a year, the scene of sustained and extraordinarily costly fighting that both sides would remember long after the war as a particular kind of hell. But in January 1942, it was the focal point of a Soviet offensive that nearly succeeded in producing the encirclement that Hitler's Standfast Order was supposed to prevent, but that the Standfast Order, by fixing German forces in place without adequate supply or reserve, had created the conditions for. The defense of the Argev pocket, and of a dozen similar situations along the front in January and February 1942, was conducted by men whose physical condition was, by any clinical standard, not compatible with the activity being demanded of them. Frostbite casualties were arriving at aid stations at a rate that overwhelmed the treatment capacity. Men with third-degree frostbite, the stage where tissue is dead, where the only question is how far up the limb the amputation will be performed, were holding positions because there was no one to replace them. Because to leave the position unfilled was to leave a gap that the Soviets would push through. Because the logic of survival had become so immediate and so local that the damaged body standing in a hole in the frozen ground was the only instrument available for the necessary work. The medical records from this period are, in their aggregate, a document of what the human body can endure when there are no alternatives. Men with fever holding positions, men with wounds dressed in the field, wounds that, in any previous campaign, would have been evacuated, the evacuation routes too dangerous or too degraded to use. Men whose mental state, what a later era would call combat stress reaction, what the army doctors of 1941 called Erschöpfung, exhaustion, had moved beyond what treatment could address in the field, who were nonetheless present, because the line they were part of was present, and the line could not be maintained without them. The cold did not pause for any of this. The cold continued its arithmetic with the same precision in January that it applied in October, and November and December, each degree below zero extracting from each human body each hour the same calculation. Heat generated minus heat lost equals the margin of survival. Below a certain margin, the body's core temperature begins to fall. Below 35 degrees Celsius core temperature, the processes that constitute consciousness and volition begin to degrade. Below 32 degrees, the shivering that is the body's last active defense against cold ceases, because the muscles that produce it are no longer receiving reliable signals from a brain that is itself becoming cold. Below 30 degrees Celsius, a human being is dying and does not know it, because the knowing requires a brain temperature that is no longer being maintained. This was not an unusual outcome in December and January. It was a common one. Men who fell asleep in exposed positions, men who simply could not sustain the effort of remaining awake any longer, who sat down against a tree or in a vehicle or at the bottom of a foxhole and closed their eyes because the body demanded it, did not always wake up. The sleep of extreme cold has a particular quality. It is warm. This is the paradox that makes it lethal. At the edge of hypothermia, the sensation of cold diminishes, replaced by a warmth that is entirely subjective, entirely the product of the brain's failure to correctly interpret the signals it is receiving. A warmth, that is, the sensation of dying felt as comfort. Soldiers who had survived the first winter on the Eastern Front and were writing about it afterward described watching their companions die this way, and they described the difficulty of intervening, of shaking awake a man who had found warmth, who had found something that felt like peace, who did not want to be disturbed from it. The supply convoys struggled through all of it. The logistical system that had been marginal in October and inadequate in November had become by January something that could be described with the vocabulary of dysfunction rather than function. A system that was partially working, that moved some supplies to some places, that kept the army alive in the sense that the army continued to exist as a recognizable entity, but that could not move sufficient supplies to allow the army to function at anything approaching the level that its commander's orders assumed. The gap between what the orders assumed and what the supply system could deliver was itself a form of attrition. Each order given in ignorance of the supply reality demanded effort from men who were already depleted, required fuel from vehicles that had none, expected sustained fire from positions that had exhausted their ammunition reserves. The railway system was a particular crisis within the general crisis. German locomotives, steam locomotives because diesel had not displaced steam on the German railway network in 1941, required water, and required it at temperatures above freezing. At -30, water in standpipes froze. Water in locomotive boilers, unless kept heated when stationary, froze and burst the boilers. Soviet locomotives had been designed for Russian winters. Death, death. Powers, destroys, wild frames, fatella. Powers, today. They had heating systems for their water supplies, insulated pipes, procedures developed over decades for operating in temperatures that froze the standpipes of German locomotives solid within hours. When German forces captured Soviet territory, they captured Soviet locomotives. When Soviet locomotives were not available, German locomotives required constant attention. Fires kept burning in the firebox even when the locomotive was not running. Water supply systems improvised. Breakdowns addressed, with repair crews working in temperatures that made metal work extremely difficult. A significant portion of the railway capacity between the Reich and the front in the winter of 1941 was consumed by the problem of keeping the locomotives themselves alive. The horses died in the thousands. This is a fact that the 20th century's focus on mechanical warfare tends to obscure, that the Wehrmacht of 1941 was heavily dependent on horses for logistical movement, far more dependent than the mechanized image of German blitzkrieg suggests, and that those horses were as vulnerable to the Russian winter as any other biological system. A horse requires 8 to 10 kilograms of fodder per day to maintain basic function, and considerably more to maintain the body condition necessary to work in extreme cold. The supply system could not deliver 8 to 10 kilograms of fodder per horse per day. The horses lost body condition. Horses without adequate body fat cannot maintain their core temperature at -30. They die rapidly and completely in the way that all warm-blooded creatures die when their thermoregulatory capacity is exceeded. And they die faster in proportion to the gap between what they need and what they have received. German regimental records from December and January are filled with entries recording horse losses, By February 1942, Army Group Center had lost a third of its horse strength, not to Soviet action, not to disease, but to starvation and cold, to the simple arithmetic of caloric deficit applied to a large animal through 3 months of a Russian winter. Each dead horse was a portion of the unit's capacity to move. The artillery, which still depended on horses for almost everything beyond the most modern self-propelled pieces, was operating with a fraction of its authorized draft animals. Ammunition that was available in supply dumps could not be moved to the guns. Guns that had ammunition could not be repositioned because there were not enough horses to move them. The army was rooting itself in place not by tactical decision, but by the progressive elimination of the means of movement. February 1942. The Demyansk Pocket, south of Leningrad. A second major Soviet offensive, this one targeting Army Group North, had by February encircled approximately 95,000 German soldiers, 6 German divisions, in a pocket roughly 80 kilometers across, accessible from German lines only by a narrow corridor at Rameshevo that was under constant Soviet pressure and that required continuous fighting simply to maintain. The Demyansk pocket would become the first major test of the Luftwaffe's ability to supply an encircled force by air, a logistical experiment that appeared to succeed, and that would, catastrophically, be applied as a model to a vastly larger encirclement at Stalingrad 10 months later. The daily supply requirement for 95,000 men, again, the number that does not care about ambition or doctrine or the logistics staff's optimism, was approximately 300 tons per day. The Luftwaffe, operating in winter conditions over Soviet-controlled territory, with fighter opposition, with airfields in poor condition, with ground crews working at temperatures that made aircraft fleet maintenance extremely difficult, could deliver on good days approximately 200 tons. On bad days, days when weather grounded all flights, days when Soviet anti-aircraft fire and fighters destroyed transport aircraft faster than they could be replaced, the supply delivery fell below 100 tons. The men in the pocket were hungry, consistently and structurally hungry, operating on a caloric deficit that compounded through weeks and then months, surviving rather than fighting, holding their positions with the last of what the winter had not yet taken from them. The corridor at Rameshevo was defended and attacked simultaneously through the spring of 1942. A strip of frozen swamp and pine forest several kilometers wide, in which thousands of men died to keep it open, and thousands of men died trying to close it. The fighting, so continuous and so costly in a small area that the soldiers on both sides who survived it would carry it as a specific weight for the rest of their lives, distinct from the weight of the rest of the war. What was happening at Demyansk was happening at varying scales across the entire Eastern Front. The German army had established a line, had been ordered to hold that line, was holding it at costs that the original architects of Operation Barbarossa had not imagined possible, because they had not imagined the winter, or had imagined it as a known factor rather than an antagonist, as something that could be managed rather than something that could manage them. The line held. This is, depending on how one chooses to frame it, either a remarkable demonstration of military cohesion under extreme conditions, or a demonstration of the institutional incapacity to make the rational decision that the conditions demanded, which was to fall back to defensible positions regardless of Hitler's orders, and reconstitute. Both framings contain truth. They are not mutually exclusive. The men on the line could not, for the most part, access either framing. They were too close to the specific arithmetic of their own survival to operate at the level of strategic assessment. They knew what they knew, that their section of the line required a certain number of functioning rifles and a certain number of men capable of using them. that Soviet probing attacks came at irregular intervals, that required those rifles to be present and functioning, that the cold required a certain expenditure of caloric energy that their rations did not cover, that sleep was necessary but dangerous, that the man next to them in the position was either present or absent, and that his absence had immediate and specific consequences for their own survival. The rest of it, the strategic situation, the supply chain, the decisions being made at Army Group headquarters and at the Führerhauptquartier, existed as rumour, as occasional news from soldiers returning from leave, as the subject of conversations conducted in the specific philosophical register that men adopt when they are discussing matters over which they have no influence, and for which they wish to convey that they bear no responsibility. The letters from the Eastern Front in the winter of 1941 and early 1942 are a literature of their own, studied by historians and collected by families, and published in anthologies that try to bridge the distance between the experience and the understanding of it. They are not, in general, dramatic documents. They are quiet ones, men writing home about being cold in the specific language available to someone writing a letter that will be read by a censor, and a family who are both not quite equipped to understand what is being described. They mention the cold and then qualify the mention with reassurance. They mention friends who have been evacuated with frostbite and describe this as fortunate rather than catastrophic, which in the context of the winter of 1941 it sometimes was. They ask for things, warm socks especially, and the fat-based skin creams that provided some protection against frostbite, and small food items that could be sent in packages, things that packed densely and did not require refrigeration, things that would survive the weeks of transit that separated the postal system of the Reich from the field post units operating east of Smolensk. They describe the landscape, the forest, the snow, the scale of it, the way the horizon in Russia has a quality that the European horizon does not have, a quality of distance without limit, the men from Silesia and Bavaria and the Rhineland, men who had grown up in a landscape of towns and fields and forests that ended in more towns and fields and forests, found disorienting in a way they could not fully articulate. They did not describe, for the most part, the things that the histories describe. They did not describe the frostbite cases that required amputation, or described them at a distance as something that had happened to someone else. They did not describe the horses dying. They did not describe the breakdown of the supply system in operational terms. They described their immediate reality in the language of immediate reality, which is the language of what is directly in front of one rather than the language of what is understood. In retrospect, the spring of 1942, when it came with the same thoroughness that the winter had arrived. The temperature rose above freezing in late March, and what had been frozen became, again, the Rasputitsa, the mud that was the ground's way of absorbing the winter, of converting the months of cold into a different kind of impassibility, a different kind of problem for the men, and machines trying to operate on it. The front solidified into something that both sides recognized as temporary equilibrium. The German army had survived the winter. It was not the same army that had crossed the Soviet border in June 1941. It was something considerably reduced, and in certain fundamental ways altered. An army that had discovered the limit of what will and discipline could accomplish against mathematics, and that had absorbed that discovery into its institutional character in ways that would shape every subsequent year of the war. The Soviet counter-offensive of December 1941 had not destroyed Army Group Center. It had pushed it back 200 kilometers in some sectors, had recovered significant territory including the approaches to Moscow, had demonstrated that the Red Army could conduct offensive operations at scale in winter. It had not achieved the encirclements that Zhukov had hoped for, partly because German resistance was fiercer than anticipated, partly because Soviet forces were also affected by the winter, partly because the logistical capacity to exploit breakthroughs was not yet present in the Red Army in the way it would be by 1943 and 1944. But it had done something perhaps more important than any of those operational outcomes. It had ended definitively, and without possibility of revision, the possibility that Operation Barbarossa would succeed as planned. Germany would not defeat the Soviet Union in a single campaign. The 8 to 10 weeks that had been allocated for the decisive campaign had become 6 months, and counting. And the enemy was not destroyed, but reconstituting, and the winter that had been a calculation in the planning process had proved to be something other than a calculation. It had proved to be an actor, the most patient and the most uncompromising actor on the Eastern Front, requiring nothing, fearing nothing, working its arithmetic without rest on everything it touched. The men who survived that winter carried it forward with them through the subsequent years of the war. Veterans of the First Eastern Front winter were recognizable to themselves and to each other by something that is difficult to name precisely, something that the psychologists of that era would have called exhaustion, and that a later era might recognize as a complex mixture of post-traumatic adaptation and a particular form of knowledge. The knowledge of what cold and hunger and the proximity of annihilation actually are, what they feel like from the inside, what they do to the texture of experience and expectation. These men were not broken, most of them. They functioned. They fought through 1942 and 1943 and further, some of them into 1944 and 1945. But they were not the same. The winter had removed something from them and replaced it with something else, and the something else was a form of knowledge that could not be shared with people who had not been there. That sat behind the eyes of the men who had been there like a secondary awareness, a second narrator who had heard all the stories about the Eastern Front winter and knew from the inside out what the stories leave feet out. What the stories leave feet out was the cold itself, not as a fact or a temperature reading or a medical statistic, but as an experience of duration. The cold of that winter was not an event. It was a duration. It was 4 months of continuous exposure to temperatures that were trying, with the patience of a geological force, to remove warmth from everything they touched. 4 months of the daily negotiation with that removal, the daily calculation of what resources remained and what costs were still to be paid, the daily discovery that the human body contains more capacity for endurance than it declares in advance, and the simultaneous discovery that that capacity is not infinite, that there is a point, different for each man, at which the negotiation ends and the cold achieves its arithmetic. The men who came home from it, years later, some of them, were asked about the winter of 1941, and they answered as survivors always answer, with specifics, with the particular rather than the general, with the smell of the field kitchen and the weight of the rifle and the face of the man next to them in the position rather than with the strategic situation and the force ratios and the operational maps that the histories used to organize what they had lived. Through, they answered, in other words, with the truth that the arithmetic cannot contain, and that the arithmetic for all its precision and all its patience cannot fully account for, that the men who were there, specifically, irreducibly, in the cold, and that the cold was real in a way that the numbers that describe it cannot be. The eastern horizon on a January morning in 1942, viewed from a foxhole in the forest west of Moscow, was a thing of specific beauty. The sky before dawn in that cold is clear in a way that temperate zone skies are not clear, because at -30 the moisture that diffuses light into the colours of ordinary morning skies has frozen out of the air, and what remains is a transparency that allows the stars to hold their light until the last possible moment, that allows the sun, when it rises, to rise into a sky that is more precisely blue than any colour made by a painter working from memory. The men in the foxholes saw this, some of them, on mornings when they were still alive to see it, when the previous night's cold had not taken from them the capacity to see, when the Soviet attack they had been expecting had not come, when the immediate mathematics of their survival had allowed them a moment at the edge of the position to look east into the direction from which the sun was rising, and to see the cold sky above the cold forest, and to be, for the time it took the sun to clear the horizon, alive in the specific and unrepeatable way that everything is alive at the edge of winter, at the edge of morning, at the edge of whatever comes next. What comes next is the rest of the war, which is its own long story. The winter of 1941 is its prologue. Its cold is the first line, written in a temperature that the planners did not forecast, and that the land had always known. What comes next is the rest of everything. But the winter is where the mathematics made itself known, and the mathematics, once known, cannot be unknown, and the snow, patient and precise and indifferent to what was buried beneath it, continued to fall.